The mist clung to the cemetery like a shroud, wrapping around weathered tombstones and muffling the sound of Harold's footsteps. For 30 years, he'd been the gravedigger at Oakwood, knowing its paths better than the lines on his palms. That's why the sound of breaking stone at midnight drew him like a moth to flame. Through the fog, he spotted a young man, tears streaming down his face, violently smashing his own tombstone with a sledgehammer. The date of death was tomorrow. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next in this haunting tale of fate and mystery. Harold froze, his weathered hands gripping his flashlight tighter. At 58, he'd spent more time with the dead than the living, finding peace in the quiet dignity of preparing final resting places. The cemetery had become his sanctuary after returning from Afghanistan 3 decades ago, the only place where the screams in his head quieted to whispers. The young man before him couldn't be more than 25, his expensive clothes now covered in dust and stone fragments. Harold recognized him vaguely, the son of the wealthy Mercer family, whose estate bordered the cemetery's north end. "Son," Harold called out, his voice rough from disuse. "What in God's name are you doing?" The young man spun around, his face contorted with terror and grief. "Step back. You don't understand." Harold approached cautiously, the way he'd once approached wounded comrades. "I understand more than most. I've buried enough to know that whatever's troubling you, it ain't worth joining them early." The sledgehammer trembled in the young man's grip. "It's already decided. I've seen it. Tomorrow, I'll be dead." Harold's eyes drifted to the tombstone. James Mercer was carved in elegant script, with tomorrow's date beneath it. A chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the midnight air. "I just wanted to break it," James whispered. "Like maybe if I destroyed it, I could change what's coming." Harold had nearly reached him when a car's headlights swept across the cemetery. A black luxury sedan pulled up, and a distinguished older man emerged, Charles Mercer, the town's most powerful businessman and James's father. "James, get away from that lunatic," Charles shouted, striding forward. "I told you to stay home after your episode." "Episode?" Harold questioned. Charles sneered at Harold, his contempt palpable. "My son has been having delusions. This cemetery rat has clearly been feeding his paranoia for some sick game." "I haven't met your son before tonight," Harold protested. "Of course you'd say that," Charles scoffed, addressing the gathering groundskeepers and security guards who'd heard the commotion. "Everyone knows old Harold talks to the dead. Probably convinced my son he's psychic now too." The onlookers murmured, some laughing nervously. Harold felt their judgment like physical blows as Charles gripped his son's arm. "Come home, James. Leave this madman to his graves." James pulled away from his father's grip, his eyes wild with desperation. "Tell them, Dad. Tell them about the tombstone you commissioned. Tell them why you're so determined to make tomorrow happen exactly as planned." Charles's face hardened as he addressed the small crowd. "My son has been struggling with mental health issues. His therapist warned us about potential breaks from reality." He turned to Harold with a dismissive glance. "And you encouraging this delusion instead of calling for help?" "I just got here myself," Harold protested, but Charles spoke over him. "Security, please escort this man back to his dwelling." Charles gestured toward the small groundskeeper's cottage at the edge of the cemetery. "And ensure he stays there while I take my son home." The cemetery security guards, men who had nodded respectfully to Harold for years, now looked at him with suspicion. One of them, a young man named Rick who Harold had trained himself, stepped forward. "Come on, Harold. Let's go," Rick said, not meeting his eyes. Harold stood his ground. "That tombstone is real. Someone carved it. Someone put it there." Charles laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally among the graves. "Are you suggesting I would plan my own son's death? That's a serious accusation from a man who talks to headstones." The gathered staff shifted uncomfortably. Harold felt the weight of their judgment. His reputation, the eccentric but harmless gravedigger, was transforming before his eyes into something darker. "Check the stone," Harold insisted. "The craftsmanship, the installation, that's professional work." "Enough," Charles thundered. "My son has been known to hire contractors for his art projects without my knowledge. This is clearly another cry for attention." James shook his head frantically. "That's not true. I never—" "James, please," Charles interrupted, his voice suddenly gentle, concerned. "You don't remember ordering it because of your condition. Dr. Winters explained this might happen. The security guards moved closer to Harold. Rick placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Time to go, old man." Harold felt the situation slipping away. The young man's life was at stake, but no one would listen to the cemetery rat over Charles Mercer, the man whose family name adorned half the buildings in town. "The boy needs help." Harold tried one last time. Charles's expression turned venomous. "The only one who needs help is you. In fact, I think it's time the cemetery board reviewed your employment. Living among graves has clearly affected your mind." The threat hung in the air. Harold's cottage, his livelihood, his purpose, all threatened in an instant. "I'll be speaking with the board tomorrow about having you removed from the premises," Charles continued. "Permanently." As the guards led Harold away, he caught James's eye one last time. The young man looked utterly defeated, allowing himself to be guided to his father's car. Back in his cottage, Harold paced the worn floorboards, his mind racing. The security guards posted outside ensured he wouldn't leave tonight. Through his window, he watched Charles's car disappear into the fog. Harold moved to his desk and unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside lay a leather-bound journal filled with meticulous notes, dates, times, observations spanning decades. He flipped to a page marked 3 years ago, where he'd noted the first unusual burial request from Charles Mercer, an empty casket for a business partner who had supposedly been cremated elsewhere. Harold ran his finger down a list of names, dates, and suspicious circumstances. His time in military intelligence had taught him to document everything, a habit he'd maintained even as a gravedigger. Charles Mercer didn't know it yet, but he just threatened the wrong man. From the shadows of a black sedan parked beyond the cemetery gates, District Attorney Eleanor Walsh observed the confrontation through binoculars. She lowered them slowly, then spoke into her phone, "Keep surveillance on Mercer. The gravedigger might be our missing witness." Harold waited until the security guards changed shifts at midnight. The new guard, a young man named Trent who often brought Harold coffee during winter shifts, was more sympathetic than his colleagues. As expected, Trent's first patrol took him to the far side of the cemetery, giving Harold a 15-minute window. He slipped out through his bathroom window, a tight squeeze for his aging frame. The cool night air carried the scent of impending rain as he moved silently between the gravestones, his feet finding familiar paths even in near darkness. Decades of walking these grounds had made him one with the cemetery's geography. Harold reached the maintenance shed and retrieved his old army rucksack from its hiding place behind stacked flower pots. Inside were the tools of his former life, a small digital camera, a voice recorder, lockpicks, and a burner phone he'd maintained for emergencies. Equipment that would seem strange for a simple gravedigger to possess. Before joining the cemetery staff 27 years ago, Harold Bennett had been senior intelligence analyst Harold Blackwood, specializing in domestic surveillance for a classified government program. His new identity had been his choice, a quiet retirement after witnessing too many powerful men escape justice. But old habits died hard, and Harold had never stopped watching, recording, and filing away the secrets of the town's elite who buried their dead, and sometimes their crimes, in his cemetery. Charles Mercer had been in his files for years. Harold made his way to the cemetery office, picking the lock with practiced ease. Inside, he accessed the computer system and pulled up the work orders for James Mercer's tombstone. As he suspected, the order had come directly from Charles Mercer 3 weeks ago, with specific instructions for rush completion and discreet installation. "Gotcha," Harold whispered, photographing the screen and downloading the files to a USB drive. Next, he checked the payment records. The transaction had been processed through a shell company Harold recognized from his previous investigations, the same company Charles had used to quietly acquire properties from families facing foreclosure. Harold's phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number, security making rounds. 2 minutes. He froze. Someone was watching him, helping him. Harold quickly closed the files, pocketed the USB drive, and slipped out the back door just as flashlight beams swept across the front of the building. Back in his cottage, Harold spread his evidence across the kitchen table. The tombstone order was damning, but not enough. Charles could claim it was preparation for an art installation or memorial, twisted but not criminal. Harold needed more. He pulled out his journal and flipped to entries from 3 months ago, when he'd noticed Charles's frequent late-night visits to the cemetery's oldest section. Harold had initially assumed grief over Charles's wife, buried there 5 years earlier. But the pattern seemed odd, always on the last Thursday of each month, always alone. Harold checked his watch. It was Wednesday night. If the pattern held, Charles would return tomorrow. The next evening, Harold positioned himself behind the crumbling mausoleum of the town's founding family, camera ready. At precisely 11:30 p.m., Charles's distinctive black Bentley rolled through the gates. The security guards, clearly expecting him, nodded respectfully and returned to their station. Charles walked purposefully to his wife's grave, placed flowers, then continued deeper into the cemetery's oldest section. Harold followed at a distance, using the monuments for cover. At the far corner, Charles approached a weathered angel statue and pressed something at its base. To Harold's astonishment, a small section of ground beside the statue slid open, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. Harold's military training kicked in. He waited until Charles disappeared below, then moved closer, setting his camera to night vision mode. The entrance appeared to be an old maintenance tunnel, likely forgotten when the cemetery expanded decades ago. Harold documented the entrance mechanism, then carefully descended the steps. The tunnel was surprisingly well maintained, with modern lighting fixtures illuminating a path that extended beyond his vision. He could hear voices ahead, Charles and at least two others. "The DA is getting too close," Charles was saying. "We need to accelerate the timeline. The property acquisitions aren't complete," replied a voice Harold recognized as belonging to Mayor Wilson. "We need another month." "We don't have a month," Charles snapped. "That gravedigger saw the tombstone. He's connected the dots, so get rid of him," suggested a third voice, Judge Harmon, Harold realized with a chill. "Already in motion," Charles replied. "But we need to move the product now. The buyers won't wait." Harold edged closer, camera recording. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber where the three men stood around a table covered with maps and documents. Behind them, stacked against the wall, were wooden crates stamped with pharmaceutical logos. "What about your son?" asked the mayor. Charles's face hardened. "James has become a liability. His episodes are getting worse. He's remembering things he shouldn't." "The medication isn't working?" Judge Harmon asked. "Dr. Winters has increased the dosage, but James is building resistance." He started asking questions about his mother's death. Harold's breath caught. Elizabeth Mercer's death had always seemed suspicious, a fall down the stairs after allegedly discovering financial irregularities in her husband's business. "And if he doesn't respond to treatment?" the judge pressed. Charles gestured to the maps. "The property development proceeds as planned. My son's tragic suicide will be a footnote." Harold had heard enough. He backed away slowly, but his elbow knocked against a pipe, producing a dull clang that echoed through the tunnel. "What was that?" Charles demanded. Harold turned and ran, hearing footsteps pounding behind him. He reached the stairs and burst into the open air, sprinting between gravestones. A gunshot cracked the night, and stone chips exploded from a monument inches from his head. He zigzagged through the cemetery, heading for the maintenance shed where he could exit through the back fence. Another shot rang out closer this time. Suddenly, headlights blazed across the cemetery as a car crashed through the main gates. It swerved between graves, heading directly toward Charles, who was forced to dive behind a tombstone. The car screeched to a halt near Harold, and the passenger door flew open. "Get in," commanded District Attorney Eleanor Walsh. Harold didn't hesitate. He jumped in, and the car reversed at high speed, tires spinning on the damp grass. "I've been watching Mercer for months," Eleanor explained as they sped away. "We suspected pharmaceutical smuggling, but couldn't prove it. Your evidence could break the case wide open." "It's worse than smuggling," Harold replied, catching his breath. "He's planning to kill his son and make it look like suicide." The tombstone was part of the setup. Eleanor's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "We need to find James immediately." Charles mentioned Dr. Winters, increasing his medication. Could he be holding him there? Winters' private clinic is on the edge of town, Eleanor nodded. "We'll head there now." As they drove, Harold reviewed the night's revelations. "How did you know I was in trouble tonight?" Eleanor smiled slightly. "Let's just say you're not the only one with a past in intelligence work. I recognized your methods the first time I observed you. Old habits die hard, don't they, Agent Blackwood?" Harold stared at her, shocked to hear his real name after so many years. "Your secret's safe with me," she assured him. "But right now, we need your skills to save James Mercer and bring down his father." As they approached the clinic's gates, Harold checked his camera footage. With this evidence, Charles Mercer's empire is about to crumble. And justice will finally be served, Eleanor added, her expression determined. What do you think of this story so far? Comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts on what might happen next in this unfolding mystery. The clinic's security system recognized Harold's face. An alert flashed on Charles's phone. His supposedly dead former operative was alive. Meanwhile, a USB drive containing evidence of Harold's past assassination sat in Eleanor's pocket, insurance she'd never mentioned. The clinic loomed ahead, a stark silhouette against the night sky. Its modernist architecture, once featured in architectural magazines, now seemed sinister, all sharp angles and reflective glass designed to keep secrets within its walls. Eleanor killed the headlights as they approached, allowing the car to coast silently down the winding access road. Security cameras at the gate and along the perimeter fence, Harold noted, scanning the grounds with practiced precision. Motion sensors, too, judging by those fixtures. Eleanor nodded grimly. Winter's clinic caters to the wealthy and powerful. Privacy is their selling point. And their weakness, Harold replied. Places like this prioritize keeping people out, not keeping them in. They parked behind a maintenance shed 200 yards from the main entrance. Harold checked his phone. No signal. They're probably running jammers. Standard procedure for high-security facilities. Then we're on our own, Eleanor said, opening her glove compartment to reveal a compact pistol. I was hoping to call for backup. Harold eyed the weapon. If Charles is here, he won't be alone. Judge Harmon likely has private security too. We need to move fast, Eleanor said, checking her watch. If they've already started increasing James' medication as you overheard, we don't have much time. Harold studied the building's layout through the trees. 3 floors, emergency exits on both ends. Staff entrance likely in the rear. Best approach is through the service area, kitchens, laundry. How do we get past the gate? Eleanor asked. Harold smiled thinly. Sometimes the old ways work best. 5 minutes later, they approached the service entrance on foot. Harold carried a pizza delivery bag he'd retrieved from Eleanor's trunk. Apparently, she came prepared for various contingencies. The security guard at the gate looked bored as they approached. Delivery for Dr. Winters, Harold called out cheerfully. Late night order. The guard frowned. I don't have any deliveries on the log. Called in directly by the doctor. Eleanor added, flashing a bright smile. Said something about a staff meeting running late. The guard hesitated, then shrugged. ID badges. Harold fumbled in his pockets. Left them in the car. Look, it's my last delivery of the night. The doctor's a regular. He'll be upset if this gets cold. The guard sighed and buzzed them through. Park by the service entrance and make it quick. Once inside the compound, they abandoned the pizzeroos and moved swiftly toward the building. Harold led them to a service door where he examined the electronic lock. Keycard entry with pin backup, he muttered. Give me a minute. Eleanor kept watch while Harold worked on the lock, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. After 60 seconds, the door clicked open. Still got it, he whispered. The service corridor was dimly lit and deserted. They moved silently past storage rooms and laundry facilities, following signs toward the main building. Harold consulted a fire evacuation map on the wall. Private suites are on the 3rd floor, he said. That's where they'd keep James if they want to keep him isolated. They found a service elevator and rode it to the 3rd floor, weapons ready. When the doors opened, they faced a pristine hallway with soft lighting and plush carpeting, more luxury hotel than medical facility. Room numbers, Eleanor whispered. Harold shook his head. They'll use code names for VIP patients. We need to check the nurse's station. They crept down the hallway, freezing when they heard voices approaching. Harold pulled Eleanor into an alcove as 2 nurses walked past, discussing medication schedules. Patient Monarch needs his next dose at midnight, one said. Dr. Winters left specific instructions. Monarch, Eleanor whispered once they'd passed. Royal symbolism, could be James. Worth checking, Harold agreed. They were heading toward the east wing. They followed at a distance, watching as the nurses entered a secure area through double doors. Harold noted the keypad code as they punched it in. For 739, he memorized. Once the nurses disappeared inside, Harold and Eleanor approached the doors. Harold entered the code, and they slipped through. The East Wing contained just 6 rooms, clearly the most exclusive section of the clinic. Each door had a small digital nameplate. They moved quietly down the corridor until they found one labeled Monarch. Harold peered through the small window in the door. Inside, a young man lay on a hospital bed, connected to an IV drip. His resemblance to Charles Mercer was unmistakable. "It's James," Harold confirmed. "And he's alone for now." Eleanor tried the door locked. "Electronic key required." Harold examined the lock. "This will take longer to bypass. Keep watch." As Harold worked on the lock, Eleanor tensed. "Someone's coming." They ducked into an adjacent supply closet just as Dr. Winters rounded the corner, accompanied by a security guard. Through the crack in the door, they watched as the doctor entered James' room. "We need to move now," Harold whispered. "Once they administer whatever's in that IV bag, it might be too late." They burst from the closet. Eleanor aimed her weapon at the startled guard while Harold rushed Dr. Winters, who was preparing a syringe. "Step away from him," Harold commanded. Winters froze, the syringe hovering above the IV port. "You don't understand what you're interfering with." "I understand perfectly," Harold replied. "Charles Mercer wants his son dead to protect his empire. It's more complicated than that," Winters insisted, his hand trembling. "James discovered what his father was doing, the pharmaceutical trials, the falsified results. He threatened to expose everything." Eleanor kept her weapon trained on the guard. "So Charles decided to silence his own son? James has been unstable for years," Winters argued. "Charles merely wanted him contained." Harold moved closer. "Put down the syringe, doctor." Winters hesitated, then suddenly plunged the needle toward James' foreline. Harold lunged forward, grabbing the doctor's wrist. They struggled, and the syringe clattered to the floor. The security guard made a move for his weapon, but Eleanor fired a warning shot into the ceiling. "Don't." Alarms immediately began blaring throughout the facility. "We have minutes before this place is swarming with security," Harold warned, restraining Winters with a zip tie from his pocket. James stirred on the bed, his eyes fluttering open. Who are you?" "Friends," Eleanor assured him, quickly disconnecting his IV. "We're here to help." Harold secured the guard while Eleanor helped James to his feet. The young man was weak but conscious. "My father," James mumbled. "He's trying to kill me." "We know," Harold said. "And we have evidence of everything, the pharmaceutical fraud, the cover-up, all of it." Footsteps pounded in the hallway outside. They were running out of time. "There's a service elevator at the end of the hall," Harold said. "If we can reach it." The door burst open. Charles Mercer stood in the doorway, flanked by two armed men. His face contorted with rage when he saw Harold. "You're supposed to be dead," he snarled. Harold positioned himself between Charles and James. "Sorry to disappoint." Charles's eyes darted between them, calculating. "You have no idea what you're involved in. This goes beyond me, beyond all of us." "Save it for your trial," Eleanor said. Charles smiled coldly. "There won't be any trial." He nodded to his men. "Kill them all except my son. Make it look like a rescue attempt gone wrong." The armed men raised their weapons. Harold glanced at Eleanor, then at the terrified James behind him. They were cornered, outgunned, with nowhere to run. The moment had come for a final, desperate gamble. Time seemed to slow as the armed men took aim. Harold's mind raced through their limited options, each one ending in bloodshed. But before anyone could fire, James suddenly stepped forward. "Stop," he shouted, his voice stronger than seemed possible for his weakened state. "If you kill them, you'll never find the evidence I've hidden." Charles's expression flickered with uncertainty. "What evidence?" "Everything, Father. The clinical trial data, the internal memos, the recordings of your board meetings discussing how to hide the deaths." James stood straighter now, finding strength in his defiance. "I made copies. Lots of them. Distributed to people you'll never find." Charles signaled his men to hold their fire. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" James smiled weakly. "You taught me well, Father. Always have leverage. Always have a contingency plan." Harold watched the calculation in Charles's eyes, the desperate arithmetic of a man weighing his empire against his freedom. "These people," James continued, gesturing to Harold and Eleanor, "are just the first wave. There are journalists, prosecutors, and federal agents all waiting for my signal. If I don't check in every 12 hours, everything goes public." Charles's face reddened with fury. "You ungrateful little..." "Sir," one of the armed men interrupted, pressing his earpiece. Security reports police vehicles approaching the facility. The color drained from Charles's face. His empire was crumbling before his eyes, the carefully constructed walls of power and influence collapsing under the weight of his own sins. "It's over, Charles," Harold said quietly. "The only question is how you want it to end." Charles Mercer, titan of industry, manipulator of markets, a man who had crushed countless lives beneath his ambition, suddenly looked old and small. His shoulders sagged as the realization of defeat settled upon him. "Lower your weapons," he ordered his men, his voice hollow. The armed men hesitated, then complied. "You think this is justice?" Charles spat at his son. "You'll destroy thousands of jobs, pension funds, research projects that could save lives." "No," James replied. "You did that when you decided profits mattered more than people." Sirens wailed outside, growing louder. Eleanor moved to the window and saw police cars surrounding the building. "Your choice, Charles," Harold said. "Walk out with dignity or be dragged out in handcuffs." Charles straightened his tie, a reflexive gesture of a man who had spent decades projecting control. "This isn't over. You have no idea who you're dealing with, the connections I have." "Maybe," Eleanor said, "but right now, those connections are probably busy deleting emails and shredding documents to save themselves." The door burst open again as police officers flooded the room, weapons drawn. Within moments, Charles and his men were being handcuffed and led away. As the chaos subsided, James sank onto the edge of the bed, exhaustion overtaking him. "Thank you," he whispered to Harold and Eleanor. "But how did you know? Who are you people?" Harold exchanged a glance with Eleanor before answering. "Let's just say your father has hurt many people over the years. We're some of them." In the following days, as Charles Mercer's empire began to unravel, the full extent of his crimes emerged. The pharmaceutical scandal was just the tip of the iceberg. Decades of corruption, bribery, and ruthless elimination of obstacles, including Harold's brother, came to light. Charles would face justice, but his wealth and connections ensured it would be an imperfect justice. Some charges would stick, others would be dismissed. Some of his fortune would be seized, much would remain hidden in offshore accounts. Yet as Harold watched the news coverage of Charles being led into court, he felt a sense of completion. The man who had operated with impunity for so long was finally facing consequences, his reputation in tatters, his legacy destroyed. Sometimes, Harold reflected, that was as close to justice as the world allowed. 3 months after Charles Mercer's arrest, Harold returned to his modest apartment above the cemetery grounds. The morning ritual that had once felt like a burden now carried a sense of peace. He brewed his coffee, watching the sunrise cast long shadows across the tombstones below. The media frenzy had finally subsided. Charles was serving time, though less than he deserved. James had taken control of Mercer Pharmaceuticals, implementing sweeping reforms and establishing a victim compensation fund. Harold resumed his quiet life as a gravedigger, finding unexpected solace in the simplicity. Each grave he tended represented a story completed, a life honored. No more nightmares about his brother's death. No more obsessive tracking of Mercer's crimes. Eleanor visited occasionally. Their unlikely friendship had survived beyond their shared mission. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence on his porch, watching visitors place flowers on graves. "You know," she said during her last visit, "you could write a book about all this." Harold had laughed. Who'd believe it? Today, as he raked leaves near the cemetery's edge, Harold noticed a woman in a black coat standing before a fresh grave. Something about her posture, rigid, vigilant, reminded him of himself from months ago. When she turned, their eyes met briefly before she hurried away. On her grave marker, Harold found a newspaper clipping about another pharmaceutical company and a handwritten note. They're all connected. Harold felt a familiar stirring in his chest as he pocketed the note. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video if you enjoyed this story. Share your thoughts in the comments below about what you think might happen next in Harold's journey.